Hello, everyone. I'm just waiting on Sohaib to connect and co-host this event today. Sohaib?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for joining us, everybody. This is going to be another space where we discuss. This is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit different than the usual ones we've had. This is going to be more of a sort of a lecture, historical style spaces discussion. We're going to discuss, the OPEC's role in the oil markets. We're going to reach back and discuss, its establishment in the 1960s. What was the idea behind it? The reasoning, what they were seeking to accomplish, what they have accomplished. We're going to reach back to the 70s. We're going to discuss and touch on the energy crisis, along with the embargo, the Iranian revolution that ensued. We're going to discuss the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, along with the market collapse then. We're going to touch base on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the Gulf War, the Asian financial crisis. So this is going to be more of a it's going to have a more of a historical bent to it. So we're going to touch point in some of the critical defining moments during the OPEC's history. We're going to touch during the September 11, record high oil prices in the recession of the 2000s, 2010, the impact of the shale revolution. We'll discuss the Arab Spring, and then that's going to bring us all the way down to 2020. And so forth, and critical moments here on in. We're gonna try to stick within our cutoff. Solid cutoff is 2 hours, nothing more than that. But we're gonna try to aim for a little bit less than that. And then as soon as we're done touching these points, we're gonna open it up for a quick Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up. But before I begin, I want to just share my appreciation and gratitude to Dr. Anaz for always jumping on different spaces as well, with the hopes of just educating the masses. It really takes time and effort to be able to do these things, and to be able to spend the time and educating people. When you could have spent the time doing other things. Everyone's appreciates their time significantly more than others do. So I just wanted to, before we begin, to share that with you, Dr. Anas. We all the time that you've spent on the Twitters, coming up with these threads, on the spaces. We really appreciate you for everything you bring to the table. So without further ado, Dr. Anas, the floor is yours, and you may take it away.
Thank you very much, Sohaib. And thanks for Hiba. Hiba is in charge of social media at Attaqa. She is in Cairo. So thank you, Hiba, very much for this. And thanks for everyone who joined us today. And please retweet the link to this space so more people can join us. I will explain what the significance of this in a minute. And if we are cut off for any technical reasons, we will be back. So come back with us, please. The first point I would like to mention here is the difficulty in today's presentation is I am putting a whole course that is about 18 lectures within 1 hour and a half. So you can see the problems I'm going to have with this, and probably I'll raise more questions than answers. And please, whatever I say, these are not matters of opinion. These are well-researched issues. And for those who do not like what I said, just bring up your research and show us the other opinions. But it's not a matter of this. And the reason why I'm saying this, because we are going to touch on about 15 countries, and I might instigate some sense of nationalism in some. So again, this is a research matter, not an opinion matter. The reason why we are covering this, because OPEC was established between the 10th of September and the 14th in a meeting in Baghdad in 1960. So officially, OPEC last week turned 62, and hence today's title is OPEC at 62. OPEC was founded in Baghdad on September 14th, since it's the end of the meeting. And the meeting, 5 countries attended the meeting and established OPEC, and those are Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran. And let me point out the following. For those who studied economics in graduate school, you might remember the difference between economic history and history of economic thought. These are completely different histories, and anyone who studies history of economic thought becomes a philosopher. And I'm not exaggerating here. This is one of the most difficult fields in economics. Today, I am mixing between the two. So I'm going to talk about economic history, and I'm going to talk about history of economic thought, because I'm going to talk about ideas. And the first idea comes from just the members, the five members I just mentioned. The founder of OPEC called them the Pentagon because there were five members. And the question is whether OPEC was intended to be only five, and OPEC would work with five members way, way better than the large number of 13 or 23. That's, again, a deep philosophical issue rooted in economic thought. And if you study the politics of each country, of each member that participated in establishing OPEC at that time, you will be shocked how they were able to pull this off. And the fact is, there were many, many differences among them. You have revolutionaries in Baghdad, you have the Shah of Iran, you have the royals of the Gulf, etc. And they all agreed to establish OPEC. And they all needed to do something to stop the international oil companies and their governments, because the situation got really bad, and I'll explain those in details. But one of the historical facts is that when the Venezuelans tried to convince the Middle Eastern countries to do something, they went to Cairo, to Egypt, and Egypt did not produce oil at that time. And all the meetings basically happened in Egypt. And OPEC establishment should have, or OPEC Foundation should have been in Cairo. But because of the feud between the revolutionaries, between the Iraqis and the Egyptians, the meeting moved to Baghdad. And that shows you that the seed of, or the seeds of differences among OPEC members existed even before the foundation. And each country has its own reasons for joining OPEC. They were not on the same page. We cannot talk about the foundation of OPEC without talking about John Rockefeller's Standard Oil, Texas Railroad Commission, and the Seven Sisters. I will explain each one of those because I know many of you may not be familiar with some of those terms. And we cannot talk about the Texas Railroad Commission and the Seven Sisters without answering a very important question that pertains to today. Does the global oil market need management? In other words, do we need OPEC, and do we need government SPR? Do we need the releases from the SPR? So the biggest question today is, does the global oil market need management? But before we do this, we need to go through some definitions because it is important to go through them. When we talk about Standard Oil, Standard Oil was founded by John Rockefeller in 1870, which means that just a year after the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania. And the company ended by a Supreme Court order in 1911, after it supported a lower court order that Standard was a monopoly under Sherman Act. This is another point to mention here. Sherman Act that was applied in 1911 to break up Standard Oil is being used today in Congress and being used for the last 20 years to break up OPEC. The same act from 1911. And we will talk about that in some details. So Standard Oil is the company that was founded by Rockefeller, and it was in control of the most of the oil industry in the United States and overseas. Texas Railroad Commission was established in 1891. That the legal establishment of it. It was functional in 1894, and it was a state agency, so it has nothing to do with the federal government. But we will see later the coordination that took place between the federal government and this state agency. It has jurisdiction over operations of railroads and terminals, which means that all the movement that we see, everything that being moved at that time was moved by railroad. So they monitored everything. They monitored the industry, and at the same time, they were able to set rates and apply the rules, how to classify freight, at what rate, etc. When the Texas legislators felt they needed to regulate the oil and gas industry after the boom in early 20th century, especially in East Texas, they found it logical to start an kind of a new state agency, but it did not make sense to have a new one. So they expanded the authority of the Texas Railroad Commission in various years for various sectors. So in 1917, they started with regulating pipelines, oil pipelines, and then in 2019 they added oil and gas production. That's why the Texas Railroad Commission right now is responsible for all the data about oil and gas production, simply because it was given the authority in 1919. And then natural gas system, which means that all the pipelines that within the state of Texas are under the authority of the Texas Railroad Commission. That was in 1920. But later, as I'm going to explain, it became one of the most powerful agencies in the world. In the world, although it's a state agency and it's based in Texas, it became one of the most powerful agencies in the world. I mean, you talk about the United Nations or the IMF. That what was the Texas Railroad Commission. Oklahoma and Louisiana created similar commissions with similar powers, but they were not as powerful as the Texas Railroad Commission. The third definition is the Seven Sisters. Now, there is no group that called themselves the Seven Sisters. This is what people who wrote about them labeled them that way. They are after the major discoveries around the world, especially in Asia and the Middle East. In Asia, especially, we talk about Burma. These discoveries with the oil discoveries in East Texas led to severe competition among the oil majors and the smaller companies that destroyed capital and which benefited no one. Everyone was losing. And we ended up with several problems. I'll talk about them in a few minutes. But the largest companies started colluding until they were labeled the Seven Sisters. And some historians make them 8 when they add the French oil company, which is now known as Total Energies. The Seven Sisters, and this is very important because I'm going to link this to Rockefeller. The Seven Sisters were 5 American companies, including Saudi Aramco. Well, not Saudi, right? But, it was Aramco Partners. Later on, Aramco became Saudi Aramco. So the Seven Sisters include the 4 Aramco partners. So there were 5 American companies. 3 of them are parts of Chevron today. And 2 of them are parts of ExxonMobil. And the funny thing is, all of them are the children of Standard Oil after the federal government broke it in 1911. So in a sense, those Seven Sisters used to be part of one company that was broken up by Sherman Act within the borders of the United States. They branched out globally and they regrouped, just like Standard Oil operating on its own. And this lasted for a very long time. And in addition to that, we have the two European companies, that BP now and Shell, they were part of those seven sisters. They controlled most of the global oil market outside the Soviet Union. And how they controlled it? They controlled it through vertical and horizontal integration. In a way, if you read the details, you will be amazed. It reached a way where, for example, if a company needed a rig in let's say in Saudi Arabia, they cannot ask a company to build a new rig. They will contact all the others first to see if they have an extra idle rig and use it. So when we talk about the efficiency they reached was amazing. And they controlled everything from exploration to production to transportation to distribution to the gas station. That's why we got all the names of the gas stations from that era, although they don't own them anymore. And they were a textbook example of monopoly, and to be exact, it's really a textbook example of oligopoly. Now back to the question, does the oil market need management? Do we need OPEC? Do we need the SPR, etc.? And that leads us to other questions. Why did the Standard Oil exist in the first place? Why it was able to end up a big, massive monopoly worldwide by combining the assets of various companies? What about the Texas Railroad Commission? What about the Seven Sisters? What about the U.S. government price controls of the 70s, when they controlled gas price? I'm talking about natural gas, oil, gasoline, etc. All of that was controlled just like as if we were a communist country. And that brings us to today's topic. What about OPEC? So John Rockefeller, and I'm making all this introduction so you can understand the basics for the foundation of OPEC. John Rockefeller saw all the wrongs, all the ills of a free market in natural resources. Massive waste of resources, inefficiencies. His objective was to end the waste, improve efficiencies on all levels, lower cost, and lower price volatility. And he succeeded. Natural resource companies are different from manufacturing companies. That is why in economics, there is a field that is separate from others, and that field is called natural resource economics, and people focus and study and have PhD in natural resource economics, simply because the rules of natural resource economics are different from manufacturing economics. And here where most people go wrong, especially engineers. I'm talking about those who venture about talking about economics and markets without realizing using the basic tools that are used in manufacturing and analyze manufacturing, which was widely common, to analyze natural resource economics, to analyze the oil market, and they go badly wrong with that. What people know about basic economics does not apply to natural resources. Natural resources, they have their own set of rules. In the oil industry, and that's what makes natural resources different. In the oil industry, in the natural resource industry, especially when we talk about oil, do you hear me, Sohaib? I just want to make sure that I'm heard.
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right, great. So in the oil industry, most of the cost is a sunk cost. If you drill a hole and it's dry, you cannot retrieve your money by filling up the hole again with dirt. That's it, it's gone. And if we find oil, that sunk cost does not matter anymore. The operating cost in this case is small relative to the total cost. Once oil is found and the company starts producing, what matters is the operating cost. So when we talk about the operating cost here, if prices decline or the market collapses, companies will produce at a loss as long as the price of oil is above the operating cost. And this will explain why when the market collapsed in 2020, many companies basically continued to produce simply because it was above their operating cost. So if you look at the stories about the massive waste of oil and natural resources around the world, and you talk about the United States, those were horrible, horrible stories, and many people were concerned about it. With market management, you eliminate waste, you improve efficiency, you lower cost, and reduce price volatility. Now, notice the word here, reduce price volatility, because we are going to go back to this several times. Increased profitability with lower price volatility ensures continued investment in the industry. And what is the problem we have today? Well, we don't have enough investment. Why? Because we don't have enough profitability and the volatility is very high. During Rockefeller time, there is something different at that time from now, but this idea still today. Rockefeller, I mean, we talk about the 1890s, etc. At that time, he needed the oil demand to increase substantially and constantly. Now, OPEC needs that, but not the same way it was in the 90s. That can happen only through relatively stable, low and stable prices. Low and stable prices. The same for the Seven Sisters. They both succeeded in stabilizing prices at low rate. The problem is the oil-producing countries are not happy because prices were low. So looking at price history, prices were relatively stable when the market were managed, and very volatile when the market were competitive. So in this case, the answer is, do we need market management in the oil market? And the answer, and this is, I know my explanation was relatively short, but the idea here is to achieve all those objectives I mentioned. Yes, the answer is yes. The market needs management. I believe in free markets. I am for free markets. But when it comes to natural resources, it has a completely different set of rules. The problem is, who is going to manage? And are they good at market management? And these are, again, I'm talking about economic thought here. I'm not talking about economic history. That seriously, who is going to manage the market? And are they good at managing the market? Rockefeller succeeded when the US government decided to break the Standard Oil empire into about 35 companies, just to show you the power of Standard. When you talk about the 35 companies, that include Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, and all the other companies that you know. So you can imagine how big it was. But when the government broke up the Rockefeller empire, it did not really study the impact. And it was a very bad decision to do it without preparing for what's going to come. Competition increased, prices decreased, price volatility increased, wastage increased, efficiencies were lost. All the efficiencies that we gained from the Standard Oil and Rockefeller approach basically were lost. It took the government, I'm talking about the US government, a few years to realize the damage from that decision in 1911. Now Sherman Act is effective, but it led to bad results. But the government, I'm talking about the politicians here, does not want to give up this powerful tool. If you can break up the biggest and the most powerful company in the United States and probably on earth at that time, why you give up this tool? You keep it, despite the damage. So what was the substitute? This government, the federal government, decided to do exactly what Rockefeller was doing, but now they need an institutional framework and a legal framework to do it. They cannot control the resources of states, so they contacted the states, and with the help of the Texas Railroad Commission and the commissions in Oklahoma and Louisiana, they were able to remedy the situation. And what was the objective again? They wanted to reduce waste, improve efficiency, reduce cost, and reduce volatility. So they coordinated this with all those commissions, and the Texas Rate Commission became very vital for the oil and gas industry. Laws in Texas were instituted, but the Texas Railroad Commission could not apply them. Why? Because it was toothless. It has no power. So, okay, if someone violated the rules, so what? And Texas producers continue to produce regardless. Although, I mean, imagine this: there was no market for the oil. So what they did is they just have those big ponds. They just fill them up with oil, and oil will go through the groundwater, etc., all kind of problems. The same things were in Oklahoma and Louisiana. Competition increased, oil prices collapsed, oil was sold at every barrel for a few cents, and oil was worthless and it was wasted. At the same time, we ended up with a problem. With the collapse in price, especially in East Texas, East Texas became a competition to all the Seven Sisters that we were talking about. The Seven Sisters did not like it, but they couldn't do anything because these things are within the borders of the United States. So the oil majors pressured the U.S. federal government to do something, and they ended up basically talking. They created a commission that talked to the Texas Railroad Commission and others. And what happened? They couldn't do anything. So the Texas governor and the Oklahoma governor ordered the well-armed National Guard to go and occupy the oil fields. They literally invaded the oil fields, took over production. We are talking about governments taking over private property by force. This was the United States of America. That was not the Soviet Union. And this happened in the United States. But now the Texas Railroad Commission have enough power with the National Guard in the fields. They were able to cut production and then control it after they were able basically literally to control everything in terms of number of barrels produced and how much each one should reduce production. However, this is a side note. Corruption was rampant as inspectors were bribed by the producer and ended up with something we call hot oil that was traded simply because inspectors turned the blind eye to that. So at that time, the Texas Railroad Commission instituted quota to every well and every producer. Notice I said quota. Quota. That was 40 years before OPEC was born. 40 years before OPEC. Now to OPEC. We are in the 30s and 1940s. The oil-producing countries, because those companies, the Seven Sisters and what we see in the United States, oil prices were kept low. The oil producers found out that they are being robbed, and therefore they needed to do something. They also found that oil was sold in some cases at really, really cheap price. They wanted their share of the pie. And what made the situation worse, of course, World War II was a big problem, especially for Middle Eastern countries, because they couldn't sell their oil because of the waterways. And some of you who follow me on Twitter might have seen that video I posted on how the Aramco partners at that time tried to ship oil on camels through Syria because they were not able to ship them on ships through the Hormuz Strait. So the oil producers throughout the world basically were not happy with the international oil companies that came out of Standard Oil, who believe that oil prices should remain low to increase demand constantly. 8 factors contributed to OPEC formation. And we talk about the eight factors. They span over a period of about 40, 45 years. And the factors, I'm going to mention them in historical order in this case. The first one is Venezuela and Mexico in 1936. Both countries were boiling. And what happened in 1936 is that was the start of change in Venezuela after the death of the military dictator, General Juan Vicente Gomez. It was a start of change, and they changed some laws, and the changes included the first or the foundation of the first oil workers union in 1936. This is a very important development, and it is important for the OPEC establishment. So the first oil workers union was established in Venezuela in 1936. In 1937, a new political party was formed under the new laws where there is more freedom relative to the past dictatorship. And they established the PDN party, which is the National Democratic Party. And it was the first true political party in Venezuela. So now we have a free political party that is nationalistic. At the same time, we have the Oil Workers Union. The Oil Workers Union went on strike at the end of 1936. That strike reduced Venezuela's oil production significantly because it lasted 43 days. The production declined by about 40%. And it ended with a presidential order. But here is the thing. Notice the date. That's 1936. That's when oil was discovered in the Middle East. So those events contributed to the rise of Middle Eastern oil. Of course, Iranian oil was discovered in 1911. So Iran on the west coast, on the east coast of the Gulf, is a separate story. But everything on the western coast of the Gulf was a completely different story. So we ended up with discoveries in Bahrain and Iraq and other countries. But those events in Venezuela and Mexico contributed to the rise of Middle Eastern oil. So the strike ended with a presidential order, and that was it. But everything was simmering. At the same year, conflict erupted between the oil workers in Mexico and the international oil companies, and they went on strike in 1937. The common thread among all those problems, if you go through Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or Egypt, Syria, Libya, you go through Venezuela, Mexico, it's exactly the same story every time, that the international oil companies, they really treated the local population like trash. They did not care about the local population, and they caused massive damage to the surroundings where the oil fields are. And there were a lot of killings. I mean, every time, and this is when you read some of the Western books on the history of oil, read them. They are great books, but you got to read them with a grain of salt because they omitted a lot of things and they took the kind of the side of the Western world view. But if you go and look at the oral history in those countries or the written history, which is not that much, you see that a lot of killings were going on. Every time kind of a labor leader emerged, was killed the second day or within a week, run over by a car, or just, we talk about Putin and people just, throwing themselves from the windows. Well, probably Putin learned that from the international oil companies at that time, because it was a horrific history in those countries. So in Mexico, they went on strike, and the president ended the strike, just like Venezuela, with a presidential order, but he ordered mediation, and they formed a council. After several months, the council sided with the workers instead of the international oil companies. The oil companies ignored them and rejected the findings of the council. So they went to the Supreme Court, the Mexican Supreme Court. The Mexican Supreme Court, after a few months, sided again with the workers, and the international oil companies rejected the orders of the Mexican Supreme Court. Immediately, the labor union decided to go on strike. The same day, the Mexican president, who is a well-known president in the Mexican history, Lázaro Cárdenas, nationalized the oil companies in Mexico. And that was on March 18, 1938. This is a very significant date for those who wants to immerse themselves in the oil industry. On March 18, 1938. That was the first nationalization of oil assets in the world. And that really reverberated throughout the world and caused a panic in the White House among international oil companies in London and all over the place. And there was a total panic. But the idea here is that all of this is going to lead to the establishment of OPEC, because the thinking about OPEC and the role of oil producers basically is becoming to be formulated. So now we have 1938, where oil is nationalized in Mexico. Back to Venezuela. The father of OPEC is Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. I have tremendous appreciation for this man and his family, by the way, because I know some personally, I know some of his family members who are amazing people. He is kind of Nelson Mandela type. He is a philosopher. He went to a medical school, but later he realized probably that he cannot do much to society being a medical doctor, and change in society through political activism requires understand of social sciences. So he went back and got a PhD in political and social sciences, and he became a lawyer. He co-founded a political party. Its name is translated to English as the Democratic Action, which in 1941. But that party was really a transformation of the National Democratic Party that I mentioned earlier after the death of the dictator, that was established in 1937. But he was part of the one of the founders of that party, and that shows you his activism. President, I'm talking about Venezuela here again. President Ramon Gallegos was the head of the first democratically elected government in Venezuela, and he appointed him as the development minister. When you talk about development for a country that is still kind of, I mean, it's not like the United States or Europe. So development is something big, and this is a very, very important post in those countries. So he was appointed the development minister in 1947, but a military coup in 1948 ended this government, and Alfonso was jailed for a few months, and then he went to exile, and he went to the United States. Now remember this, he went to the United States. But the United States was very expensive for him, so he went back to Mexico. So mentioning here United States and Mexico is very important for the establishment of OPEC. Now notice this. After 10 years, democracy came back to Venezuela. President Romulo Betancourt asked Alfonso to come back, and he appointed him Minister of Mines and Hydrocarbon, which is equivalent to the Minister of Energy by today's standards. But what happened in the early years when he was a Minister of Development, and what happened between 1948 and 1958 when he was in the United States and Mexico? That's very important. First of all, when he was a minister in the first government, he came up with several ideas. One of them is that those international oil companies are robbing us, and we need to do something. And he came up with 50-50. What that means is we split the profits 50-50. That increased the cost on the international oil companies in Venezuela significantly. And that's why they went to the Middle East. That's why the growth in the Middle East happened, because Venezuela was the largest oil producing country at that time. And they went there. Now, the Venezuelan government noticed, especially the one that came with a coup, noticed that they just lost market share to the Middle Eastern countries. But they still adopt the 50-50. I'm talking about the bad governments during those 10 years. And one of the things they've done was they decided to educate the Arabs. Educate the Arabs, this is taken from a document, by the way, so these are not my words. But it shows you that, when you talk about Venezuela, the leaders, many of those leaders basically were probably second and third generation white men, Europeans. And they still have that obnoxious attitude. So when they decided to educate the Arabs on the 50-50, it wasn't because they cared about the Arabs. It was because they lost market share to the Arabs and they want to retrieve it. So their idea is, if we convince the Arabs to go for 50-50 profit sharing, then we are at equal footage and then we can retrieve our market share. But they did a big mistake. When they tried to go to the Arab world, they were kicked out and they were not received by the Arab countries. And the reason why, because that government of Venezuela voted for the establishment of Israel at that time, and the Arab countries refused to receive the group of people who came to educate the Arabs. So the only place they were able to go to is Iran, and they went to educate the Shah of Iran on the 50-50. The problem is, the Shah of Iran couldn't do anything because he signed when the U.S. brought him back, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. When the U.S. brought him back to rule Iran, he signed off on the oil industry completely, the Iranian oil industry, to the companies, to international oil companies. So he has no say on that. So their efforts basically were wasted in those years. Then when he came back, or when he was in exile between 1948 and 58, he came to the United States and he was literally obsessed with the Texas Railroad Commission and its ability to manage production. So he studied every aspect, and he talked to a lot of people. He studied every aspect of the Texas Railroad Commission and its control of the market, and he envisioned OPEC. So those who want to sue OPEC in Congress should remember two things. Its foundation was American. It was modeled after the Texas Railroad Commission. Also, the first announcement of OPEC establishment, we are celebrating this, talking about September 14th in Baghdad establishment in 1960. Well, the fact is, the announcement was made in May, few months before September. Where? In Taylor, Texas. In Taylor, Texas. The announcement of OPEC was made in Taylor, Texas, in a conference for Texas oil producers who treated OPEC founders, that Alfonso Perez and Abdullah Tureki from Saudi Arabia, like royalties. So those who wants to sue OPEC, basically, they need to go back to history and check out how OPEC came about. But again, Alfonso Perez invented the 50-50, which led companies to switch to Middle Eastern oil and probably led to major changes even in Iran and other places. We'll talk about that. When people talk about the foundation of OPEC, they talk about two people. They talk about Alfonso Perez and they talk about Abdullah Tureki, who is the first Saudi oil minister. But when you look at the historical records, it is very clear that the thinking about it happened in the 40s when Abdullah Tureki was still a student. So yes, they co-founded this, but the idea probably should be attributed to Alfonso Perez. Abdullah Tureki was from Saudi Arabia, was a nationalist leftist. So he was kind of more supportive of the regimes in Egypt and Iraq, and probably that's why he did not last for long. And you can see his views that matches those revolutionaries more than the monarchies. But in the history books, they say that Abdullah Tureki was introduced to Alfonso Perez through a female journalist. I found through my research that that's not the case, because the students who were studying with Abdullah Tureki in the United States were working for Alfonso Perez, and they told Alfonso Perez about him, and they were exchanging messages way before they met face to face through this lady. And I don't want to dwell on the role of this lady in the establishment of OPEC, but I can tell you one thing, that what is written in the history books about the oil industry may not be accurate, because I think she was more than a journalist. And there are things that I don't want to talk about, but there are pictures of her appearing in swimming pools, etc., with some OPEC oil ministers, which kind of raise a big question on her role in these things. So I think she is more than a journalist, and probably some other organizations are involved. So we ended up with the Mexican nationalization. We ended up with the situation in Venezuela with 50-50. And then Iran nationalized its oil in 1951 when the Shah was kicked out and he left to Iraq, and then he went to Rome, and then Mohammed Mossadegh took over. This gave the Arab nationalists the idea that we can do that too, and we can nationalize. So everything was simmering throughout the Arab world and other countries like in Africa and Latin America. That's in 1951. Then in 1956, Jamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal, and for those who are familiar with the Suez crisis, etc., but it was important because oil was transported through the Suez Canal. That's give more hope for those who want to nationalize or take control of the oil industry. And then, of course, we have Arab nationalism. There are other reasons that contributed to the establishment of OPEC, which is the shady accounting practices of the oil companies, and the massive profit they made relative to the revenues of the oil producers. Just to give you an example, the international oil companies were making $1 a barrel in net profit, while the Saudi government was making 4 cents on each barrel. So the Saudi government was making 4 cents, while the 4 Aramco partners were making $1 profit on each barrel of oil. On the shady accounting, for example, the Saudis found that the companies lied several times in various ways, and they realized that there is a treaty, or the U.S. law allow U.S. companies to deduct their taxes paid to foreign governments, but the companies kept telling them that's not the case. And then when they found out, basically, they were able to transfer all the money that's been paid to the U.S. government to the Saudi government because of those shady accounting practices. And there were other things happened at that time where the U.S. Imposed import quota, and they reduced their imports from Venezuela substantially. That kind of give the Venezuelans an incentive to do something. And the final straw that broke the camel back in 1959, when the oil companies decided to reduce posted prices twice that year. So what is the term posted prices? Posted prices have nothing to do with market prices. No one knew at that time what the price that the Seven Sisters charged. Why? Because they controlled everything. For those who are familiar with transfer pricing. So they take the oil, they run it through the refineries within their own books. They cook the books in a way where they sell at certain price, etc., etc., and then the final profit basically is made at the end. So no one knew exactly what the price that the Seven Sisters charged, and they were vertically integrated, they were horizontally integrated. So what people knew is just the price of products that you get from the gas station for, let's say, kerosene or gasoline. But host governments needed to get their taxes, and they based their taxes on the price. And what is the price? They don't know. So they came up with the idea of a posted price. Let's agree on a price, and we will tax you on that. So that's what the posted prices. So when the oil companies unilaterally agreed to cut prices twice, posted prices twice in 1959, it literally meant reduction of those government revenues. Now, remember what I said earlier, that the governments did not care about the governments, did not care about the population, did not care about the environment, did not care about the livelihood of people around them. They just wanted to drill for oil, get the oil, ship it, and make money. So now we are in 1960. OPEC was established, and they chose the headquarters in Geneva. There was a problem here. The Swiss government refused to recognize OPEC as an international organization. So they stayed there for about 5 years, and then they moved to Vienna because they literally got the approval that they will be recognized as an international organization. OPEC was established, as I said, 5 members, and then other countries joined. Qatar, but Qatar left, as you all know, in 2019 because of the political dispute. And then Indonesia, other countries like Libya, United Arab Emirates, Algeria. By the way, this is a common mistake here. You see Abu Dhabi and you see United Arab Emirates. Abu Dhabi joined before the establishment of the UAE, and therefore its name appears Abu Dhabi. But when the UAE was established and Abu Dhabi became the capital, whatever applied to Abu Dhabi applied to the UAE. Algeria, Nigeria, Ecuador. Ecuador suspended its membership a couple of times. Then Gabon, the same thing. Then Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and then Congo. So they've been added over the years. This is very important. These additions are very important because, as you know, in the Congress, there is this OPEC law that they tried to pass several times. And it did pass twice, once during the Bush administration and once during the Obama administration. But the President Bush and President Obama did not refuse to sign them, but at least ignored it. So it's never been applied. Still, anyone can revive it at any moment right now. But the idea here is one of the issues with Sherman Act is exclusion, which means that Standard Oil was excluding others or taking over others by certain practices that are not allowed by the law. Well, if you want to use that, it does not apply to OPEC because OPEC been adding members, especially with OPEC Plus now, they are 23, and they are always adding members. So that goes against the law in this case if this goes to court. Now, when we talk about the I have here a question. I need to kind of rephrase it. It's not clear when we talk about the what OPEC accomplished in the 60s after it was established. Royalties were not included in the cost. As you know, here in the United States, when companies sign a contract with the landowner, the landowner gets royalties. That has nothing to do with anything else. And some clauses basically add profit to that. So when companies sign contracts with countries, right now, they get royalties and they get profits. Well, at that time, that was not the case. Most of those countries were primitive. People were in the Middle East, like looking really for water. They want someone to drill for water, not for oil. So they don't know, they don't have the legal experts. So royalties were not included in the cost. Therefore, revenues were less than otherwise. The main success of OPEC in the 60s is to expense royalties. So those countries will get royalties regardless of posted prices, regardless of the profit. So they get the royalties, they expense that. That was a major success for OPEC. Also, another success for OPEC basically is called for members for more participation in the production decisions. But some historians basically raise the question that wouldn't these things happen regardless of the existence of OPEC? That countries basically realized the fake accounting practices of the companies, and therefore they were looking for expensing royalties, and more participation? That question is left to historians in this case. Here comes the 70s. When we talk about the 70s, we are talking about some major events. When you talk to anyone about major events in the 70s when it comes to the oil market, the first thing that comes to mind is the oil embargo of October 1973. For those who follow me on Twitter, you've seen a couple of long threads on this. It is very hard for me to talk about, we cannot call it OPEC embargo, because it wasn't OPEC that came up with the embargo. And it's not a WAPEC that the Arab oil producing countries. It's not even a WAPEC because several members did not participate in it. And it's not Arab oil embargo because many Arab countries, not many, but some Arab countries did not participate in the embargo. They were against it. So it's very hard to label it, to give it a label. And I found that the best label basically is to label it as the 1973 embargo, oil embargo, or the October 1973 embargo, oil embargo. Because all other names, basically, people will raise questions about them. But there were many other events that are very important. The increase by fourfold in prices was not related to the embargo as some people think. It is related literally to other things. And let me give you an example. The embargo lasted only for a few months and then be lifted. Why prices stayed at the high level and did not decline? Why they did not go back to the pre-embargo level? So it wasn't the embargo. There were other things. And there are two major things. Number one is the embargo literally covered the energy crisis in the United States. The energy crisis in the United States started in 1971, and it got worse and worse and worse. Most of the picture, and please hear me out here because this is a very important comment I'm going to make here. Most of the picture you see about gasoline lines today that been brought in from the 70s and say gasoline line from the 70s because of the Arab embargo, they did not. Those pictures, I traced every single picture. All those pictures, not all of them, but most of them basically were from 1972 and early 1973. The embargo happened at the end of 1973. So gasoline lines existed before the embargo, and before the embargo by a long time. And if you go back to the thread, you see all the evidence and all the clips from various newspapers and magazines that I provided. So it wasn't the embargo. The energy crisis existed simply because demand increased substantially. And then the US imposed price controls. Remember now, the Biden administration is talking about price controls. Europeans are talking about price controls. It was a total disaster because it did contribute to the energy crisis at that time. So we have price controls. We have the energy crisis that existed since 1971. And if you look at Nixon's speeches were before the embargo when he talked about the energy crisis. And the term energy crisis was very common in 1972. So the energy crisis existed. Price controls were a part of the problem. And the other reason is, by the time the embargo happened, OPEC met and they posted prices and they cut production. And all of those together basically helped sustain prices after the embargo. The other event in the 70s that played a major role is the labor strike by Iranian oil workers in 1978. Remember, Iran has a long history of troubles, and the Shah was kicked out in 1951. So these things been simmering for a long time. So when they went on strike, Iran was one of the largest oil producers in the world at that time. It produced 6 million barrels a day. 6 million barrels a day. So they went on strike. Prices started going up again in 1978. And then the revolution happened in 1979, and prices went through the roof. And then we've seen all the other measures that the consuming countries took because of the increase in prices. By that time, prices continued to increase until they reached about $44 by early 1980. So the major events in the 70s were the energy crisis in the United States, followed by the embargo, by OPEC decision, and then by the Iranian labor strikes and by the Iranian revolution. Here comes the 80s. And the 80s, basically, we ended up with several other issues. In the 70s, one of the things that happened and people did not pay attention to is we have discoveries. We have the North Sea oil was discovered, but was very expensive to produce. And we have Alaskan oil. The US Congress refused to approve the Alaskan pipeline for several years. And here comes the embargo. The embargo happens within few days, the Congress approved the Alaska pipeline. And that immediately after the building of the pipeline by, I think, 1977, 1978, it added 2 million barrels a day to the world supply. 2 million barrels. And then we have the North Sea oil was developed again after the embargo, using national security arguments and using the high prices, using fear, etc. The North Sea was developed, added 3 million. So by 1980, 1981, 1982, we have an additional 5 million barrels a day coming only from two sources, in addition to all other sources coming from all around the world. By that time, the Soviet Union basically was trying to export to non-communist bloc. So we have additional supplies coming from the Soviet Union and other places. The issue here is with the additional supplies and because of massive inflation, high prices, all the rules and regulations, all the laws that have been instituted to replace oil, the efficiency standards, the CAFE standards, etc., all of that started paying off by 1982. At the same time, we have President Reagan, who liberated energy markets in the United States, and prices just collapsed. But there was a major change here. When OPEC was established for the following reason: to get rid of the members' dependence on oil. Let me repeat that again. OPEC was established. I mentioned the 8 reasons that surrounded the establishment, but the main reason for the establishment of OPEC is literally to get rid of dependence on oil. They wanted the 5 members to be just like European countries, in a sense. They want them to be advanced. They wanted to take the wealth and transfer it to something else and be developed countries. They wanted to be independent of the World Bank and the IMF. That was part of the things. However, they came up with the idea that supply has to match demand all the time. Supply has to match demand all the time. Now, remember this, because I'm going to go back to this point one more time. The problem is, for supply to match demand, you need quotas. But OPEC never imposed quotas until 1982. Why? Well, because the companies controlled the oil in those countries. So when people talk about the Saudi behavior in the early 70s or other countries' behavior in the 60s, well, those countries they were not in charge of their oil. It was the American companies in charge of their oil. So it wasn't the Saudi policy. It wasn't the Kuwaiti policy. Some of those countries were not even independent at that time. So we cannot talk like this. So what happened is, again, the objective is to balance supply with demand all the time, get the best price they can, and then convert their economies and develop them quickly to get rid of oil. They don't want to be dependent on oil. But they never instituted quota. When the role of the Seven Sisters and the Texas Railroad Commission ended in the 70s, who was managing the market? No one. So the federal government found itself again, just like 1911, being basically in charge, and they decided to impose price controls. Again, they managed the market through price controls for about 11 years. And when Reagan liberalized the oil market, he literally threw the ball in OPEC's court, and OPEC was not ready. The OPEC did not know what to do. How they are going to manage a market where they have no quota? So they started thinking about quota, what to do, etc., etc. By 1982, they were able to establish a quota system simply because the ball was thrown at their OPEC court, and they did not know what to do with it. And even when they have quota and oil prices started decreasing, and they wanted to use them and they wanted to cut production. They failed miserably in the 80s, to the extent that the market, as you all know, collapsed in 1985 and 1986, to the extent that we have some evidence to show that some companies sold oil at $3 a barrel. There are other evidence to show that oil was sold at $9 at that time, but the market collapsed. But there was another event in the 80s, the Iraq-Iran war. And that's why oil prices went up in early 80s, because those countries started destroying each other. But by mid 80s, the market collapsed completely, although we lost Iranian and Iraqi oil. We had a lot of oil at that time. So pay attention to the fact that losing you can have a case when you lose a large amount of oil and prices decline, because we have that in the 80s. By the time oil prices started improving, the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988. Things started improving. Things looked brighter as oil prices started improving slowly. The balance of supply and demand started improving. And in August 1990, Saddam Hussein goes to Kuwait, and all hell gets loose. That was followed by the Gulf War. As you all know, prices increased substantially at that time. When we talk about the use of the SPR and the need for management, the SPR was used. The spare capacity by OPEC was used. We have the Gulf War. And notice this, the moment the Gulf War started, prices collapsed. Why? Because they really prepared for it, where they placed all this floating storage in main markets. And when they decided to go for war, they just flooded the market. And I'm talking about several countries, not only one country. And they flooded the market, and prices declined. So we are talking about the 90s here. Things started after this collapse. The market was kind of stable. Prices started improving in 1995, 1996. And then a big mistake was made by OPEC, specifically by Minister Naimi of Saudi Arabia, when they decided in 1997 to increase production by 2 million barrels a day. And I can tell you at that time, we were stunned. We were literally stunned. I mean, where that oil is going to go. There was no market for it. And a couple of months later, we had the Asian financial crisis, and everything collapsed. Everything. Here comes 1998, a total collapse in the market. Oil prices were like $9, $10. Everyone was suffering, etc. And it lasted long. I mean, we did not see a recovery until March 1999. And since everything been dry for the last hour, let me tell you a joke about what happened at that time. I was on a committee for a conference, and we got a paper from a French expert who sent a paper. He said, why oil prices will stay low. And that was in 1999. That was in early 1999. And that paper was accepted for the conference. But the conference was in May of that year, and prices went up from $10 to $35. So he showed up at a conference with a paper, the title of it, Why Oil Prices Will Stay Low, but prices basically kind of more than tripled. So he stood up in front of everyone, and he said, well, I sent this paper, and the title is this, and it's in the conference materials. The title is Why Oil Prices Will Stay Low, but let me change it now and say why oil prices will stay high. Yes, we do have this type of experts, or what so-called experts. Anyway, so now we are in year 2000. In year 2000, oil prices were around $35, and we have Al Gore running for election and versus George W. Bush. And for those who accuse Biden of using SPR as a political tool, well, guess what? It was used that summer as a political tool. For those who can dig up some of my articles at that time, they can see that there was no reason for the SPR release in that summer, except political, to help Al Gore. Anyway, we started with the release of the SPR. Prices were relatively strong. Then we ended up with September 11th, with the skies basically being blocked completely, no flights, etc. The demand decreased. Oil prices were decreasing at that time anyway. OPEC was supposed to meet on September 13th to cut production, but after the event, of course, they couldn't, so they delayed that. Uh, then we started seeing improvement in prices, and that improvement led to major increases in prices, especially in 2004, because of China. China became a net importer of oil, and they were receiving all those companies from around the world, etc. Then, as we move to 1996, 1997, now oil prices are above 100 until we reach $147 in 2008. And as you all know, we have the collapse of oil prices when we had the financial crisis and the financial crisis and the recession. If you go back to all those events, what you see is you see OPEC basically increased production, use spare capacity whenever the market was tight, and they literally cut production in every event when we have a decline in demand or a major recession. So they did cut in 2008 twice. They did cut in 1998 twice, and then they cut again, I think, in early. My memory does not serve me right here, but I think they cut 3 times: 1998, 1999. And they cut several times, or they announced cuts several times in the 80s, but none of them worked. One of the reasons for the collapse of the market is that, and notice this number, the Saudis cut production from 10 million to 2. 10 million to 2. So we have a decline of 8 million barrels a day, and yet, with the loss of Iranian and Iraqi oil during the war, yet prices continue to decline. And finally, when the Saudis got fed up with the rest of OPEC for not complying, they decided to flood the market. So they increased production from 2 to 4, and the market collapsed. That forced OPEC to meet and cut production. So now we are in the production cut of 2008. They did cut production, and they were able to raise prices from about 35 to 75 despite the recession. Now compare that to the mid 80s, when they were not able to do that. Then prices started improving. We are at 75, 2010. 2011, we have the Arab Spring. We lost oil from several countries, as you all know, from Egypt, from Tunisia, from Libya, later on from Syria, from Yemen, and prices went up. They were about $120. But by that time, we have something new that happened, and OPEC did not pay attention to: the shale revolution. The shale revolution started adding massive amount of oil, and OPEC, instead of taming prices, lowering prices to 75, they insisted that they wanted prices to be high, and they did not do anything about $120. And the shale revolution basically took advantage of that. The OPEC leadership did not realize the impact of shale until later, at the end of 2014, early 2015. And here I use a special term here. Basically, it took OPEC by 2015 went through the 5 stages of grief, one by one. 5 years of shale, 5 stages of grief, until in 2015 they acknowledged shale. They thought prices could stay low for about a few months and then will go up again. They did not. And they waited and they waited and they waited and did not. And there were several reasons for that. One of them is the major increase in Iraq oil production, major increase in Russian oil production, etc., in addition to shale. So OPEC basically was literally not able to do much until 2016, when they decided, okay, I'm going to cooperate with non-OPEC members, and they ended up with the OPEC Plus agreement. and they started cooperating. We've seen some successes until 2018. In 2018, oil prices were above 85, which was tremendous success to the cooperation of OPEC Plus members. But in the fourth quarter of 2018, we ended up with Trump interfering in the market. Let's say it, Trump managing the oil market, since we are talking about market management. And he wanted to reimpose sanctions on Iran, since the Iranian production increased after 2014, when the Obama administration and what we call the 5+1 agreed to the nuclear deal that was signed in 2014. So in the fourth quarter of 2018, Trump decided to reimpose sanctions on Iran. He asked the Saudis to increase production to compensate. They did. And after he made sure they did, he stabbed them in the back by giving exemptions to all of Iran customers. And the market collapsed and prices just collapsed. And I was one, and I know several, I can see some people here who lost money at that time because of that. And the Saudis learned a very hard lesson from it and what happened. Anyway, they kept working with OPEC Plus. Prices improved substantially after that. Toward 2019, people were expecting big improvement in 2020. And then we ended up with several events in 2020. One of them that took place between March 5 and 7 in 2020. That's the Russian-Saudi dispute that led to market crash when the Saudis decided to increase their production to full capacity after Russia decided to increase production to full capacity and other members. And they reduced the Aramco official prices substantially. But that was not the main reason for the collapse in oil prices in 2020. It was COVID, as you all know. And when we talk about OPEC now, it's OPEC Plus. We have a major accomplishment that took place in 2020. Of course, President Trump claimed the success for this because supposedly he talked to the Russians and he talked to the Saudis and others and asked them to cut production by 10 million barrels a day. We don't know how accurate is this, whether he got the inside information and he said it publicly or he really kind of implemented this. We don't know. But what happened is in April 2020, OPEC Plus met and decided to make a cut that I myself did not even foresee. Even a few days earlier, I was saying that this cannot be. They cannot pull this. But I was wrong, and they pulled it. They pulled this off. But they had a problem with Mexico. So the cut was 9.7 instead of 10. And they started implementing the cut. Now we are in 2021. Demand improved substantially. Countries opened up. Economies opened up. They needed to increase production, but they decided to do two things here. They decided to increase it in a measured way. So it was a measured increase in production to make sure that there will be no oversupply. That really helped big time in improving prices. But there were other things. And one of the things that happened, and this is one of the main characteristics of 2021, is that for the first time in the history of OPEC and now OPEC Plus, that the large oil producing countries with spare capacity did not infringe on others' market share who couldn't increase production to their quota. Historically, one of the failures of OPEC that every time demand increased, prices increased, some countries could not increase production. So the larger countries with spare capacity took their market share. And that's why always kind of people look at OPEC as they will never agree on things. They will not do this, they will not do this, etc. But now things are completely different. The larger countries respected their quota, respected others' quota, and that helped prices increase. But as prices increased and reached $70, $75, we have another problem. All of a sudden, we have a new entrant to the market that's going to cause serious problem in 2021. That was China. China used its SPR. And the only reason why we did not get $100 oil in 2021 was the Chinese release of the strategic petroleum reserves. So OPEC faced a new dilemma. OPEC faced a big problem. Here is OPEC largest customer, China, is fighting OPEC. And that is really a big problem. Here comes 2022, and we have three new developments in 2022. The first one is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Russia is an OPEC Plus member. And then we have the massive release of the SPR by the Biden administration, which has another kind of things that OPEC found that it has to fight. And the third one is OPEC now, or OPEC Plus, evolved, and its policy evolved. And now it's not only the meeting and the results of the meeting, whether increase or decrease production matters. If you are an oil analyst or an oil trader, you have to pay attention to three things to analyze OPEC behavior. The first one is OPEC decision to cut or not to cut. And this OPEC decision usually happens before the 5th of the month in general. And on the 5th of the month, in general, Saudi Aramco releases its official selling prices. So you need to look at that, because Saudi Aramco decision could nullify OPEC decision or could support it. So you cannot make decisions based only on OPEC decision. And the third one is the what OPEC is going to provide to or OPEC Plus is going to provide to the market. And this point I emphasized several times in the past. There is a difference between supply and production. Don't worry about production numbers, because they don't mean much. Focus on supply numbers. Supply could be higher than production. It could be lower than production. And if you look at the latest numbers, and it seems that the media missed this one. If you look at the latest OPEC report and look at the Saudi production based on secondary sources versus the numbers that the Saudi government provided to OPEC, there is a major difference that did not exist before. And that shows you that there is really a difference between supply and production. With that, this is kind of a sum up of a lot of things. I know there are certain things I did not cover because it takes a lot of time. But Sohaib, let's start some questions, and we still have 40 minutes for questions and answers. Sohaib?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm just pulling up Falado to the stage, and he's on cue for the first question.
Will you please let me, if you don't mind, I just want to make the following announcement here. Please, okay. Let's start with questions, no comments, just questions. And the questions have to be within today's subject, not other things. Please.
Yes. Yeah, if we could just keep the questions just relevant to what was discussed so far. So Fildo, go ahead, Fildo. Okay. All right. Fauzi, go ahead.
Hello. My question is, what will OPEC do if the prices of oil is collapse, and in next 10 years, if the alternative energy will develop? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Fauzi. First of all, I can assure you that oil demand will continue to increase, and renewable energy, when we talk about solar and wind, is not a substitute for oil. And the reason why, because solar and wind produce electricity. Oil is rarely used to produce electricity in Europe, China, India, and Canada, United States. So don't worry about the solar and wind in this case. The only issue we have to worry about here is electric vehicles, and that's very clear that is going to eat up some of the growth in oil demand, but it's not going to kill even the growth. So demand for oil will continue to grow. However, if we have recessions, which is expected, whether this year or in the next 10 years, etc., we have some serious problems related to the economy. we will see OPEC Plus acting exactly the same way it acted in the last 2 years. This coalition is different from anything we've seen in the past. And I'm going to take this opportunity here to mention something related to something I said in the beginning, which is when OPEC founders wanted the supply always to be matched with demand. For supply to be matched with demand, you need quota, and you need monthly meetings, and you need really kind of to pay attention to all the changes in the market. You need to be flexible. You don't want even to wait until the end of the month for the monthly meeting. That was in 1959. And what we've seen in the last 2 years is the return of the vision of OPEC founders. And especially when we talk about, if you look at the Saudi vision and other countries' visions, like even Oman and others, when you talk about the 2030 or others, you look at what those countries are aiming. What they want is they want to reduce their dependence on oil. That was the vision of 1959. And at the same time, they want supply to equal demand at all times. That's what OPEC Plus is exactly doing. So in the last 2-3 years, we've seen a return to the vision of OPEC in the 50s. Back to you, Sohaib.
We got Street Hawk. Go ahead, Street Hawk.
Thank you, Dr. Alhajji. That was fascinating and so informative. Thank you very much. Now that you've brought us up to date, I have 3 quick questions, and you can choose to answer them in any order that you wish. My first question is, moving forward,
Street Hawk,
yes.
If we could just do one question at a time. Usually, whenever you do 3 questions all at once, by the time you get to the second or third question, it's just forgotten. So just one at a time. Thank you.
Okay, one at a time. Okay. First question is, okay, I'll ask my third question first, because that's the one that's most important to me. The discrepancy between paper and supply price. Do you see, that changing, and perhaps as people realize that renewable energies are not going to come online tomorrow, that oil is here to stay? Is money going to pour back into the industry, and share prices of companies increase to reflect more the reality of what we're seeing on the supply side? That's my first question, that discrepancy. How do you see that being cured going forward?
Will you please ask the question without framing it? This is really an advice to everyone, that when you ask a question, don't put it within a certain frame that you like or just ask the question as bold as it is, without the frame. So could you ask your question without framing it?
Yes. Moving forward, there seems to be right now a discrepancy between the price of paper and supply when it comes to oil.
You are framing it again.
I'm framing it again. So let me ask you another question. Let's say we have a global economic collapse because of what we're seeing. Where do you see the floor for the price of oil?
If you go back to the previous spaces, from my point of view, OPEC Plus will defend 90. If we have a severe recession, they cannot defend 90. Prices will go. I think the floor is in the 60s. That's it. They will go back and cut production significantly. So I see the floor in the 60s. Back to you, Sohaib.
So we'll do Street Hawk. We're going to move around the room, and then we'll come back for your other questions. We'll go with Phoenix. Go ahead, Phoenix.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anas. I was wondering if you could describe the relationship of OPEC and Russia during the Cold War, and also where you see the relationship of OPEC and Russia going forward. Thank you.
Generally speaking, of course, we are talking about the Soviet Union, in this case, not only Russia. The Soviet Union oil basically was mostly traded within the communist bloc on barter. So if you go back to the old books and old outlooks, etc., you will see that everything was said this way. total world supply, excluding Soviet Union, USSR. This excluding USSR. Almost all publications, and if you need to write even an academic paper, you have to write that statement that excluding the USSR simply because no one knew what their production is, how they traded this, etc., etc. So in a sense, it was out of the system, out of the market, but it was there, but it was a closed system to the world. So there was nothing. But the idea of cooperation with Russia started about 30 years ago. Not only Russia, basically, that include even Norway and Mexico. And there were negotiations and meetings, etc. These things did not really bear fruit until after the formation of OPEC Plus. And regardless of the details, the relationship among OPEC members, OPEC Plus members right now is very strong. And the relationship between the Gulf countries and Russia are very strong. And I don't want to elaborate much about this, but let me give you a couple of examples on how to understand those relationships. As you know what Biden said about the leadership of Saudi Arabia and about Saudi Arabia. You know how Democrats think about oil and how they think about dependence on oil in general and fossil fuel. Now look at what Putin did to Saudi Arabia. When there was a vote in the UN Security Council against Saudi Arabia because of Yemen and the Yemen war, guess what? Putin who vetoed that. And when there was a resolution on climate change in the UN Security Council, if it was implemented, it would have been a crisis to all oil producers worldwide. It would have been crisis to the Arab world, crisis to every single oil producer in Africa. It would have been literally devastating for those. Who stood and vetoed that? It was Putin. And who was pushing for that? The US. So I think I just told you what the relationship is. Back to you, Sohaib.
So we're going to go over to Troutster, and then right after you, we have a better stock idea. So Troutster, go ahead. No, Troutster is no longer with us. Better stock ideas. Go ahead.
So this kind of ties into that last question. How do you think OPEC would react to an attempt by Russia to weaponize its oil supply by cutting dramatically? And do you think that OPEC would kind of seek to step in to fill that supply gap? And do you think that they have the spare supply to do that?
Okay. I'm going to put my academic hat here and answer the question. First, we have a full space, about 2.5 hours with Sohaib. About 3 months ago, it was on weaponizing oil and energy. And it is on YouTube. So if you search it, you will find it. It is on Twitter too. So you can go and listen in details to the details of that. But to answer this shortly this way, again, I'm putting my academic hat here. Who weaponized energy? Those who impose sanctions on imports of energy, or those who are trying to sell it? In a sense, from academic point of view, it looks like everyone is weaponizing energy. It's not only Russia. And those who impose sanctions first are weaponizing energy before the others. And I hate to be, in a sense, or to look like defending Putin. But the fact is, it is those who impose sanctions, basically, using energy, weaponized energy too. And energy is used, or energy weapon is, if you go back to that space, it's used throughout the world. And the country that uses the energy weapon more than any other country is the United States, and then the EU. So that's number one. Number two, for the Gulf states with their relationship with Russia, if you look at the decisions and you look at the pricing, it is very clear that there is this unwritten agreement or tacit agreement that Russia will export the oil that was designated to Europe. It will export it to India, China, and other OPEC members and anyone who wants to buy it, while others in the Gulf will redirect their oil to Europe instead of the Russian oil. In this case, everyone is benefiting from it. So regardless of weaponization, the market already worked its magic in redirecting oil in different directions. This is not efficient. It increases cost. It causes problems. And we already seen that the traffic in the Suez Canal increased. We've seen for a while, until recently, that tanker rates increased substantially because of this. So it did cause some inefficiencies, but the market is working its magic in redistributing supplies to meet the sanctions requirement. Back to you, Sohaib.
All right. Who do we have here? We've got Better Stock Ideas here back with us. Go ahead. And then after that, we'll go over to Abdulaziz and then Tomas. Go ahead, Better Stock Ideas. Okay. Not with us. Isaac, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Anas. I wanted to go back to a question. I think this is like a really basic kind of fundamental question, but you mentioned that you mentioned the difference between production and supply figures. And, the production data is pretty easily available, but I was wondering, like, what can we do? Like, what are the best sources to get really good supply figures that might give us a better picture of what's really happening in the physical markets?
It is really exactly the opposite. The supply figures are available. The production figures are questionable. So the supply numbers, the reason why, because those countries have to ship this oil either via pipelines, so we know the amount, or via tankers, and we know the amount through those companies that monitor shipping and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can get the supply numbers. The issue is, are the production numbers that accurate? That clear?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, is there any data that's out there that, like, is there a good source of data to get like the real actual production figures, or is it seems like it's kind of
basically let me put it this way. Let me show you how important your question is and how bad the situation is. Even OPEC itself, and its calculations of the quotas, they depend on those companies for their own production. Isn't that funny?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous, and like, there's not really. It seems like I would guess that like the data that we actually get like is off by at least like 1 or 2 million barrels on either direction.
I don't think it's that much. I think this 1 to 2 million is coming out of the confusion between supply and production. I think there are differences, and especially if the numbers we are getting are the average. Let's say, okay, we deal with 4 companies that monitor production and exports, and I take the 4 companies and I take their average and I publish their average. So you can imagine probably one of them is correct and the other 3 are not, but you can see how the average deviates from the correct number. So I agree with you.
Thank you. Yeah, just like everything else, I mean, the truth is kind of somewhere in the middle because it's all self-reported, but the average is probably the best way to look at it.
Yes, and I have a final comment on this. Let me kind of make a true case here. We don't know which storage number is correct or more correct. Is it I'm talking about the weekly storage in the United States. Is it the IEA figure or is the API, the American Petroleum Institute figure? The fact is, we don't know. No one knows who is better than the other and what the correct number. But what matters to the market is what the market believes about those numbers. So even if the market believes that the number is different from the other 2, that's what the number is. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter who is correct in this case. What matters is whom the market is going to believe. Sohaib?
Phoenix, go ahead. No, Phoenix. Tomas?
Hi, I hope that you can hear me. Again, Anas, thank you for your great speech. It's a pleasure to hear you again. And I'm looking forward for your talk with Eric Townsend. And sorry for being provocative with this question, but regarding to the weaponization of oil, or rather weaponization of the dollar, could you tell us what has to happen to see more and more volumes traded with euros or yuan, and what type of circumstances you can acknowledge that it can be happen? I remember that you are very skeptic about it, but we are in the times of war, and Russians are doing what they are doing. Thank you.
Yes, there is a full space on this. You can check it on YouTube and you can check it on Twitter. Right now, of course, I cannot explain this in details, but there is a short answer since you asked. Basically, it does not take much. And everything we are seeing right now, and I think people are making a mistake here, especially those who are really kind of the anti-dollar group, um, because we have enough evidence to show that when Russia decided to do things in yuan, well, this was a replacement to an old system that existed that used either gold or national currencies or the euro before. So it's not an additional things that happen. It's just a replacement of something that happened before. Yes, what the embargoed countries, because all the countries that are trying to dish the dollar are embargoed countries. So from pure academic point of view, we don't have evidence to show a country in case of complete freedom, no sanctions, want to dish the dollar. We don't have a single example of that. All the countries that want to dish the dollar have problems with embargoes with the United States and probably with the EU too. So the question here is, if we have a completely, or if we completely lift the sanctions, will they do the same? We don't know. Again, this is an academic question. But the issue here is, with everything we've seen so far, the dollar lost some ground, but it did not lose its dominance. And there are no signs that it will lose its dominance. And if you study the history of currencies throughout centuries, you find out that countries or currencies that collapsed and lost, they collapsed when their countries collapsed. It has nothing to do with some other currencies emerging as a substitute. We don't have a single example to show that. It's when the civilizations collapse, their currencies collapse with them. When the Great Britain is no longer Great Britain and it's only Britain, well, guess what? The sterling lost its ground. It did not happen because of other countries introducing other currencies. So yes, I'm still skeptical, and I still believe that dollar is a king and will remain a king, and oil will remain priced in dollar. Back to you, Sohaib.
Abdulaziz, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anas. Just a quick question. I'd like to ask you about the forecasted inflation. How would OPEC react to that? Would like to shed you to shed some light on the mechanism between OPEC and the oil pricing when it comes to recession.
Yes, this question is important, and it is related to the previous question about the dollar. One of the main concerns of OPEC historically was inflation, and how inflation eats into the value of a barrel of oil that's being exported. And of course, the devaluation of currencies too plays a big role here. And the reason why, because OPEC sells its oil in dollars, but their trade partners are in different currencies in different parts of the world. And therefore, currency exchange rates matters, inflation matters, because they import a lot of stuff. So when the United States decided to float the dollar in the early 70s, that caused a major problem for OPEC, because oil was priced in dollar and the value of the dollar just dropped. And therefore, their real revenues just dropped. And they were trying to find a replacement for that. So they studied all options, trying to find another currency, another way of doing this. They looked at that time, of course, there was no euro. They looked at all options, including the IMF SDR. They looked at gold, etc. And they realized, after experts made several studies, some of them are still secret, some of them are published publicly, that the best choice is the dollar no matter what. And the reason why, because to price oil in a currency, you need three conditions. The first condition, liquidity. You need enough liquidity. Right now, this year, the value of oil trade worldwide is $1.6 trillion. $1.6 trillion. So you need liquidity. It is very clear that historically only the dollar have that liquidity. You need a currency that is relatively stable. That's the dollar. And you need a currency that is widely acceptable worldwide. And that's the dollar. So the dollar was the natural choice despite all the inflation it causes, despite all the reduction in the purchasing power of those countries, and despite all the problems with exchange rates with countries they import from. And they've been dealing with this for a very long time. And we did a lot of research on this historically, and the main result was there is no solution. The best solution basically is literally to diversify imports as much as you can. The problem is there are certain imports you cannot diversify. I mean, if you want to buy some weapon system, you cannot just divide the system into pieces and say, I want to do this and this. No. So there are problems because the economic solution is to diversify imports, but you cannot because there are things that you cannot diversify. So they still have problems. If you go back to OPEC report, every report, they talk about the inflation and the currency exchange rates and its impact on the purchasing power of OPEC exports, which is a major problem, will continue to be a major problem. And one of the reasons why the currency of the Gulf states, except Kuwait, are pegged to the dollar is exactly this reason. Back to you, Sohaib.
We're going with R. Monroy.
Thank you. I was just going to ask the doctor, he mentioned about the arbitrage of countries like Saudi Arabia, India, and China buying Russian oil or gas and then reselling it to Europe, either in refined products or their production itself. Would this be impacted by, and then everybody profited, of course, in the deal. Would this be affected, though, if Russia's discount were to be reduced, either because of the market price of the oil is lower, and the would the volumes change in that respect? In other words, the profit would be less. So to do that type of activity. Thank you.
Generally speaking, when the market is tight, think about it this way. What the Chinese and the Indians and others are getting, in a sense, think about it the same way you go to a store and let's say here in the United States, you go to Texaco or you go to Costco or other places and you have coupons with you. You are buying the same item the guy behind you is buying, but he has no coupons. So you use the coupon, you get the lower price. The guy behind you has no coupon, he gets nothing. This is exactly the same thing. The price is still the same. The price is not going down. It just you got a lower cost to you because you have a coupon. And that's exactly the case with the Russian oil. That's the case when the market is tight. The problem is if we have a recession and we don't have a production cut, then you have a surplus and probably we'll see competition at that time and we'll see some serious problems, although I believe that OPEC Plus will cut production. So in a tight market, the discount that those countries are getting, it works just like a coupon. Back to you, Sohaib.
What do we have? So we have R. Monroy, your hand's up, but did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, and but if the market is not tight and basically the coupon value goes down, I guess that you're saying then the volume of that activity may go down to maybe even zero because there's just not enough profit for them to deal with the friction in the market. Thank you. Is that correct? Thanks.
Well, it depends on the value of the coupon. So the whole idea here is you can take that item and literally sell it to the other guy at the door of the store at the high price, right? So you can do that unless there is a condition that you cannot, or you are going to lose warranty or some other conditions, etc., attached to it. But in terms of oil, that does not exist right now. So as long as the coupon is about $25 to $35 right now, then it will work for those countries. They can either reduce their inflation or resell it. Sohaib?
Street Hawk, we could proceed with your second question now.
I'm good, Sohaib. Thank you. I'm working on something right now. I'll
No
chime
worries.
in later.
No worries. Reem, go ahead.
Just very briefly, this new, let's say, relatively new cooperation amongst OPEC members, do you see that extending to or reflecting in members deciding to join BRICS?
These are completely different issues, but I think what happened with OPEC and the experience they gained, if they decided to join BRICS and whatever the new name for that BRICS is going to be, definitely they are going to bring those experiences in. But I think they are completely separate issues at this stage.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Abdulaziz?
Yeah, thank you again. My question, Dr. Anas, is how has OPEC dealt with the periods of recession or inflation in the past? And would like to see you extrapolating and tell us what is your opinion about the OPEC reaction in the future in case of recession.
Yes, we do have enough evidence basically to answer this question with some clarity. If you go back, I went through the history here, and I mentioned like the 80s and then what happened in the 90s and then in 2000s and all the production cuts. And historically, the production cuts during recessions were partially effective simply because of cheating. And there was no way to kind of force the others, because this is why an issue I did not cover today for lack of time is whether OPEC is a cartel or not. And I think two things here. Academically speaking, there is no way we can prove that OPEC is a cartel. In U.S. courts, based on U.S. court requirements and under the Sherman Act, there is no way under Sherman Act you can prove that OPEC is a cartel. But the media use it, and certain people in the media use it on purpose. And I'm saying this with enough evidence to irritate certain people. But the fact is, there is not a single evidence so far to prove that OPEC, I'm not talking about OPEC Plus, I'm talking about OPEC. OPEC is a cartel. All the evidence show that it's not a cartel. Now they are claiming within OPEC Plus that it is a market manager. That fits with the history where we talked about today. We talked about Rockefeller. We talked about the Texas Railroad Commission, the Seven Sisters, the involvement of the U.S. government in price control, etc. So it fits with that history. The problem is it failed to some extent simply because it's not integrated like the Seven Sisters. OPEC only sell crude. Their operations are not integrated vertically, not integrated horizontally, and they don't have enough legal power like the United States did in the 70s, because anyone who violated the price controls basically would be sued and probably fined and jailed. We've seen this in Texas and Oklahoma, where the government literally used the armed National Guard to occupy the oil fields. OPEC does not have a military, does not have a National Guard. So they were not able to manage the market the same way the others did, but they can manage the market on the fringes in extreme cases. They can prevent oil prices reaching 150 or 200, and they can prevent oil prices from declining, let's say, to 20 and 30. So they can manage the market this way. So in a sense, they are market manager with some limitations, and they don't have the same power that the others have. Back to you, Sohaib.
That pretty much concludes all the questions for today, Dr.
Okay,
Anas.
I have a comment because I skipped a couple of points here to make. When we talk about OPEC reaction to the shale revolution, As I mentioned, OPEC ignored the shale revolution for a few years, and they just kind of like, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing, until they got stuck in 2014 and realized the power of it. And people think that the collapse of the market and the reaction of Saudi Arabia by increasing production by 1 million barrels in 2015 was reaction to shale. Here is the problem with that thinking. U.S. shale was not exported outside the United States until, or not allowed to be exported until the end of 2015. So how the Saudis will take an action or a decision at the end of 2014 to flood the market as a reaction to shale that is not in the market. So I just want to kind of explain this myth that no, it does not look like it's a reaction to shale, but the shale revolution has tremendous impact on OPEC historically. And there are several articles I wrote on the subject. You can just search my name and search the impact of shale and you will find some. First of all, with the increase in shale revolution, with the increase in shale production, we ended up with the following cases. If you look at OPEC members made strategic decisions since the 1970s. Why they made those decisions? Because after the increase or the quadrupling of prices in 1974, they have a lot of money, but they have some serious problems because inflation is eating up the return if they put it in a bank. So interest rate was almost zero. European and US basically was confiscating assets, so that was not a good choice. So there was no real return on capital in this case. So what to do? So they asked the IMF and the World Bank for help, and they come up with the idea that, look, you have a competitive advantage in energy-intensive industries, so why you don't build energy-intensive industries, including petrochemicals, and use your competitive advantage? Although at that time, it was very clear that the market was not supportive of petrochemicals, and the market basically was really saturated at that time and oversupplied. Anyway, they made several decisions, and some of those decisions basically including building the largest petrochemical complexes in the world because their methane and ethane basically, or ethane, is cheap, while others are using naphtha. Naphtha is out of the oil complex. Oil prices were very high, so they can compete with the rest of the world. And then they adopted another policy, which is building refineries and for export, so they can export products and take the advantage of the value added. They focused on NGLs because NGLs are not part of OPEC quota, so you can sell NGLs without the involvement of OPEC. And then later on, as you all know, they have the Asia pivot, where they said, okay, we are going to export to Asia, and Asian countries, especially China and India, are going to be our friends. Then the shale revolution came in and literally destroyed every single strategic objective of those. The shale revolution brought in massive amount of methane and ethane and made petrochemical industries come back to the United States. So the competitive advantage, they are gone. Then refineries, well, because the shale revolution enabled us to produce massive amount of light crude that can produce massive amount of gasoline that we don't need. And we cannot export the crude, but we can export the gasoline. So all of a sudden, products exports of the United States increased substantially and literally took market share from those countries. So they lost on that one too. And then when you talk about NGLs, the shale revolution brought massive amount of NGLs to the extent that the price in the market is no longer set by Saudi Arabia, it's set by U.S. producers, especially in Latin America. So the shale revolution basically affected OPEC in all places. And then when we allowed crude to be exported starting in 2016, all of a sudden that pivot to Asia lost too, because we started exporting oil to Asia. So the impact of the shale revolution was tremendous. But the 2015 decline has nothing to do with shale, because shale was not exported to compete with the Saudi oil until later on. And one of the reasons, or one of the main reasons, is if you go back and look at the data, the major increases in oil production came in from Iran, Iraq, and Russia. It did not come from the United States. The United States lost almost 1 million barrels a day at that time. So I just want to clarify this point. Back to you, Sohaib.
That pretty much wraps us up, Dr. Anas.
All right. Well, thank you all, and I really appreciate your attendance today. And this will be recorded and will be posted immediately on Twitter, and then it will be posted on YouTube within a couple of days. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for doing this. We took a little bit of a different turn relative to the regular ones we've done. We've done more of a historical piece here today, and for anyone else that missed it and is interested in hearing about the origination of OPEC and some history, feel free to tune in and listen to the entirety of the space. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Anas.